Welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian. Today I'm here with none other than Toby Young from the UK. Toby, how are you?
I'm good, Peter.
Good. How's my tea making ability?
For an American, pretty good.
Thank you very much. I'm attempting to ingratiate myself with the customs of your people.
Well, good start.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we're going to dive right into it.
So I'm the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, which I founded in 2020. It's a mass membership public interest body that stands up for the speech rights of its members and campaigns for free speech more widely. And I'm the editor-in-chief of the Daily Sceptic, which is a skeptical news publishing site. Started out life as Lockdown Skeptics, launched it in March 2020, pretty much at the same time that Britain introduced its first lockdown, and it segued into becoming the Daily Sceptic. We publish 5, 6, 7 pieces a day, mainly by skeptical academics, journalists, intellectuals. About our big 3 topics are everything lockdown, COVID related, including the vaccines, climate science.
I like the middle finger there for that one.
Yeah. Climate science, and wokery-pokery in all its manifestations. Those are the 3 things we're mainly skeptical about. And I also write a weekly column for the Spectator and have done since about 1998.
I love the Spectator. All right, so it's interesting, skepticism more from a lot of the woo that Sherman and others put the Skeptic magazine and others, and James Randi from telekinesis. It goes through these phases. Homeopathy, alternative medicines. But now people are using those, but the tools are the same, right? Like Bayesian reasoning, evidence. Offering arguments. There's nothing particularly.
Empiricism, the empirical method, seems to be a common characteristic too. But no, I don't think the methods have changed, but what we're skeptical about, that's probably changed.
The content has changed. The method is the same. Do you think, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but do you think that there are any topics that are more impervious to reason, evidence, and argument than others?
Well, one of the common characteristics of all 3 of those subject areas is that there's quite a lot of dogma permeating all 3, and they seem to have a religious aspect.
That's what I thought.
And their believers often are impervious to evidence and reason. I mean, it's really hard to change their minds once they're inside the church in all 3 of those subject areas. And there's a great overlap too. I mean, mostly it's the same people in all 3 areas. But we found that, trying to persuade climate hysterics, for instance, that, Arctic summer ice is increasing in size, the volume of forest area across the globe is increasing, that kind of thing. When you present them with this kind of evidence that actually we don't appear to be heading in any sort of straightforward way towards a climate catastrophe, they're completely impervious to it. They often accuse you of being a denier, as though you're as irrational as a Holocaust denier. That it's quite difficult to engage in anything like a kind of constructive, good-tempered discussion with anyone who is kind of squarely in those churches.
Do they become upset? I mean, in your experience, so you've had face-to-face conversations, I assume.
Yeah.
And do they lose their temper? Do they become upset? Do they become offended? Like, what mechanism? Because you wouldn't need any of those things if you had evidence, right? You just present the evidence.
Well, often when you're debating with thoughtful climate scientists, it's not just straightforwardly, well, here's my evidence versus here's their evidence. It's often the question of how to interpret the evidence. What's the provenance of this particular data set, and how reliable is that data set compared to my data set? You can talk about data sets they're relying on being corrupted in some way, and they'll dispute that. And it becomes quite, you get into the kind of these fine-grained, quite academic arguments. There's another argument I often get into with people in all 3 of these areas again, I think, which is take climate science. They often say, look, unless we change our ways, unless we achieve net zero by 2050, or the world achieves net zero by 2050, the world's going to there's going to be a climate catastrophe.
Right.
So we have an overwhelming moral responsibility to do what we can to mitigate the likelihood of that catastrophe materializing. But when you then push them to, well, what is the likelihood? If we do nothing, what's the likelihood? Is it a reasonable worst case? And can you attach a probability to that reasonable worst case? Are you saying there's a 10% likelihood, or is it lower than that? And, often it is lower than that. So then the argument is about, well, why should I cause myself harm now in order to avoid harm, which there's only really a 1% chance of it materializing? It's Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
And then it becomes quite a kind of metaphysical argument about how do you persuade someone not to adjust their behavior to mitigate the likelihood of a high consequence, low probability risk materializing. That obviously applied to lockdowns. The rationale for lockdowns wasn't that if we do nothing, rather than locking down, more harm will be done.
Yeah.
The argument was, well, even if it's true that the harm of locking down is going to be greater in all probability than the harm of not locking down, we should do it anyway, because there's a 10% chance that if we don't lock down, there will be catastrophic harm.
So,
and as stewards of the public realm, the Commonwealth, we have a moral duty to put safety first. It's about safetyism. How do you argue with this kind of safetyist neuroticism?
So it's not truly Pascal's wager because you're wagering something. Have you ever, but it's also invokes a kind of precautionary principle. Have you ever spoken to someone and they changed their mind in real time?
I don't think so. No, that could be just testimony to my poor persuasive powers.
Oh, well, then,
but when people...
I have a book for you.
I think when people do change their minds and kind of become, heretics or apostates from these particular churches, it doesn't seem to be as a result of examining the evidence or thinking deeply about what it is they believe and why they believe it.
Right.
It's as though they're released from a cult at some point. They kind of wake up and realize that they were down this kind of dark rabbit hole. But it doesn't seem to be prompted by that. That awakening doesn't seem to be straightforwardly prompted by confronting them with evidence and trying to reason with them.
Yeah, I've written about that pretty extensively. Why you shouldn't present evidence in a conversation, even when asked.
Right.
Yeah, and people think that's insane, but they clearly have not read the literature. In fact, I was just speaking at the Battle of Ideas about, someone asked a great question about, well, they didn't say it, but the backfire effect. And when you look at the backfire effect, it appears to be a unicorn. It can't be replicated. But when you really drill down on the subsequent literature, it's never about something that has a moral valence, right? So it's always about these fairly benign, innocuous, pedestrian issues that I think is really interesting. Okay, so I have just so much I want to talk to you about, and I don't want to be mindful of your time. I do have resonant in my head right now thoughts about the kinds of dispositions that you think, like, what makes people susceptible to this? What are the commonalities? What do you think, like, if you just trace the history of skepticism, what do you think the next big things will be? I think aliens will be the next thing. I've said that over and over again. Quick take on that. You think because society is going to be consumed by an obsession with extraterrestrial visitation and whether or not we're in possession of extraterrestrial craft?
Yeah, that seems to be a growing belief system. I once spoke to Christopher Hitchens about this, actually, and he wasn't entirely dismissive of the belief in UFOs or the belief by some people that they had been taken up into alien craft and experimented on. He was kind of, at least in the context of this conversation, I'm not sure whether he was playing devil's advocate or really believed it, but he made quite a persuasive case for not completely dismissing them.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's a supernatural event. So, I mean, you have to just look at what the arguments and evidence is, and when they come back with truth, why don't they ever come back with truth about how to solve Goldbach's conjecture or bladder cancer. So like, why don't they ever come back with some empirical, like something other than telling us to love everybody?
Yes. Is it straightforward? I mean, I'm not a ufologist.
Neither am I.
But they're not presented exactly as supernatural events, are they? I mean, I guess in some cases to travel faster than the speed of light or whatever claims are being made, you'd need to break the laws of nature. But it's not always straightforwardly obvious that the person making the claim is claiming that in this instance the laws of nature were broken, in which case Hume's argument against miracles would kick in pretty persuasively.
Not supernatural, they're naturalistic phenomena, naturalistically explainable. But I predict that would be the next object to which we ought to turn our skepticism. I could be wrong about that, but
I'm more fearful of what I think of as a kind of hybrid of two religions, which is the kind of woke concern for the weak, the vulnerable, the historically marginalized, and climate hysteria. And we see this already, and it informs some of the hysteria around COVID too, which is that we have an overwhelming moral duty to do what we can to avoid harmful effects of climate change, because the people being harmed are disproportionately the least well off, the most disadvantaged: women, people of color, etc., indigenous people. And that kind of hybrid, it's a toxic cocktail. And I can imagine that being very powerful and sweeping up a lot of people and being quite hard to combat, particularly when it presents with a kind of patina of scientific credibility.
Patina is a good word. I'd love to see a conversation between, say, Matt Ridley and Dorian Abbott. Or I'd like to see a thoughtful conversation between two people who are both move in the public space and work as an intellectual area. I haven't seen that. All right, I want to talk to you. What I wanted to talk to you about here is a separate issues unrelated to skepticism, or maybe somewhat related to skepticism. But one of them is you've taken a pretty strong stance on free speech. In fact, from the Free Speech Union, would you say you're vice chancellor? What is your title?
I'm a general secretary.
General secretary. So what is your stance on free speech? And could you give us the 30-second version?
Yeah, I think I would defend the principle enunciated by the US Supreme Court in, I think, Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is, within certain limits. I wouldn't defend child pornography, certain extreme forms of libel, betrayal of state secrets, at least not in every case. But within those limits, speech should be permitted unless it's going to cause imminent lawless violence. And I think that's a pretty good principle, although it's slightly circular.
Let's linger on that. Imminent lawless violence.
Yeah.
Linger on that. That's important. Reed, play this clip. I just did spectrum shrewd epistemology with Constantine and Francis.
Next claim. People should be free to chant "Gas the Jews" in the streets.
Which country?
Of this country, the UK. Why not?
Should people be free? And I'm sure you've seen the pretty horrific videos now of people in the street. Yeah, you don't need the headphones anymore. We'll wait for a while. Of people in Australia screaming "Gas the Jews." Of people on subways. I don't know if you saw that clip, screaming "Kill the Jews." Of people. I don't need to go into it. There's no need. There's no reason to pollute our consciousness with that. But
yeah,
what's your take on that?
Well, obviously, I find it deeply offensive and upsetting. And I can understand why people would want that to be unlawful. I mean, in this country, saying those kinds of things is unlawful. I think if you shouted out "Gas the Jews," on a tube train, you'd be in breach of stirring. You'd be guilty of stirring up hatred against people based on their religion, which is a breach of the Public Order Act. It's one of the stirring up offences. But I'm not sure that in the US that would be illegal, because it would only be illegal if it falls foul of that standard. And as I understand it, the reason the neo-Nazis were able to march in Skokie is because they were calling for the extermination of Jews in general, but not specific identifiable Jews they were encountering in the course of their march. So they didn't pose a threat of imminent lawless violence. So by that standard, the march was permitted. I mean, I do find it kind of a really difficult test case, harder, in fact, than Holocaust denial. I don't think Holocaust denial should be against the law. I think much
neither
better.
Neither did
Hitchens. And it isn't against the law in this country, like it is in Austria. But the reason for that is because I think it's better that people should be able to set out their case in the public square for why they think the Holocaust didn't happen, so it can be comprehensively and conclusively rebutted with evidence and reason. And if you suppress Holocaust denial, people are likely to conclude there may be something in it, or more likely to, than if you allow it to be set out in the public square. I mean, I think that
bottom line, gas the Jews, should we allow that or not in this country? Should you? Not we. I'm not a citizen, but
well, the Free Speech Union wouldn't advocate for repealing these stirring up offences in the Public Order Act. By this, we have a statement of values on our website, and we have kind of two basic rules. We won't defend speech which is straightforwardly unlawful. We might campaign to change the law, but if it's straightforwardly unlawful, we won't defend it. And we won't defend it if you're using your right to free speech as a way to try and shut down, silence your opponents or people whose points of view you find disagreeable. And we think that being racist, victimizing, bullying, harassing, those aren't forms of speech we defend, because they're almost always deployed. No, because they're almost always deployed to try and silence others and deprive them of their right to free speech. And I think gas the Jews would probably fall into that category.
So, okay, so I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. So you, as every sane person, finds it odious, but you don't think it should it be illegal to shout gas the Jews
in a Jewish neighborhood?
In the UK, on the island here, on your island?
I think the test would have to be, I mean, I'm not about to campaign to change the law in the UK to make that legal. And it's not something the Free Speech Union would ever defend. But from a philosophical point of view, if it's not going to cause imminent lawless violence, which I think in some circumstances it could, then philosophically, I don't think it should be banned.
So if there are a bunch of people on a train, nobody's Jewish, somebody starts screaming, I don't know, I was going to make a little rhyme in my head, but then someone would meme it out, so I won't do it. But, you know, like, they start screaming about killing Jews. You don't think that behavior should be illegal?
If it's not going to, well, it is illegal.
No, but that kind of begs the question, should it be illegal?
Should it be illegal?
Yeah.
I think the test should be the same test that was deployed in Brandenburg versus Ohio, and that the best standard from a free speech point of view is the standard upheld by the Supreme Court under the First Amendment, which is that if it's not going to cause imminent lawless violence, then it should be permitted. And even though that does mean permitting things we find absolutely abhorrent and reprehensible, we can easily imagine circumstances in which our own speech would be curtailed if we have a lower threshold that we appeal to when prescribing speech.
So you're not a free speech absolutist?
I'm not a free speech absolutist, no. I wouldn't defend child pornography, betrayal of state secrets, And the problem is that when it comes to free speech, I think it's unrealistic to say there are never going to be other rights, other conflicting rights, which are going to be engaged. I mean, one of the reasons we can't enunciate a legal standard which protects free speech absolutely is that there's always going to be room for the discretion of judges when upholding the law, because they're always going to have to take other rights into account
and subordinate those rights. Like I have a hierarchy of rights.
Well, it's difficult to stipulate a hierarchy of rights in all circumstances whereby you remove any room for the discretion of the judges. That's why the First Amendment, good though it is, doesn't alone protect free speech, and wouldn't have protected free speech in the way it has without a succession of Supreme Court justices interpreting it in a particular way. Hate speech laws, for instance, wouldn't have always been struck down in the US if you had a different composition of justices on the Supreme Court, because there's always going to be room for judicial discretion. You can't guarantee free speech in law alone. There has to be a kind of supporting culture, and you have to have the right judges in place who are going to prioritize it. But to stipulate that they should prioritize it in the law over and above all other counter rights, alternative rights in all circumstances, I think that's unrealistic.
Right. I mean, precedents in contemporary jurisprudence changes depending upon the composition of the courts. And so have you found that many people who have claimed to be free speech absolutists are suddenly silent when it comes to this idea of gas the Jews? You've seen a kind of
that's an extreme example. There are more kind of I think there are kind of, the examples are some people who've previously been very pro free speech, drawing the line at people chanting "from the river to the sea" on protests, or drawing the line at people calling for an intifada from London to Israel. And you can see why someone chanting that on a train would be extremely disturbing to a Jewish passenger on the train, as though the person chanting it is calling for them to be killed. But is it going to lead people on the train to attack them? If it does, if chanting "gas the Jews" led to a Jew in the immediate vicinity being attacked, then of course it should be against the law. But I think unless you can be reasonably sure that that's going to happen, it's difficult philosophically to make an argument for preventing it. Because if the causal chain is too nebulous, if you can't show a direct causal link between someone saying something like that and someone being attacked, then that would be an argument for prohibiting all kinds of speech. It could, in certain circumstances, lead to someone being attacked. You might say it to someone who is particularly mentally disturbed. You weren't aware of their presence, and they then went on to attack someone. Should that be a reason for prohibiting speech? Because someone who's disturbed might overhear it. And it's sort of complicated by social media too. If you say something like "gas the Jews" on a protest march, and no one on the protest march kind of attacks any Jews that they encounter on the march, but if someone sees it on social media and then attacks a Jew, well, is that a sufficiently robust causal link? Seems to me it probably is for you to prevent that person saying it. But I don't want to be kind of excessively safetyist, and this is where the safetyist argument comes in again.
So your claim, and I want to make sure I understand this correctly, is necessarily causal. And so if chanting this causes people to attack Jews, your claim is that it should not be legal.
Yes. But if it's merely upsetting or offensive, even profoundly offensive, I don't think that's a high enough bar to prohibit the speech. because that's a standard that could be applied to prohibit all kinds of speech.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw you a couple of curveballs, but before I do, what would it take to change your mind about that? That we know that something is not definitely going to cause people to engage in physical violence, but more than likely to cause people to attack. It doesn't have to be Jews, whoever. I just picked that because it's a relevant issue today. Blacks or people from, I don't know, Mexico or something, but Sweden. What would it take to change your mind?
Short of the group
like we
being
know
targeted actually being attacked.
Well, no, we know that when people shout this, causally the people of that specific group get attacked. What would it take to convince you to change your mind and that we should lawfully allow this? That there's something that takes precedence in speech over any of the consequences of that speech.
You mean, what would it take to change my mind that even if someone chanting something racist did lead directly to an attack on the racial group they're targeting, are there any circumstances in which I might permit that anyway?
Yeah.
I don't know. Give me an example. Can you think of a circumstance which you think would challenge that Supreme Court principle?
I'm asking the question because we were complaining about the three categories that you write for Skeptic. What's the name of the magazine again?
The Daily Sceptic.
Yeah, excuse me. Sorry about that. For the Daily Sceptic, and then being a kind of theology or church.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if we're not in a theology or church, and the way to figure out if you're not in a theology or church is to ask if there are any conditions under which you'd be willing to revise your belief. And so I'm not saying that's universally true. Like, oh, are there any conditions? Do you have kids?
Yeah.
Are there any conditions? And I wouldn't torture my kids for fun. Well, are there any conditions which would change your mind? No. But I'm wondering in this case, I'm concerned that we may be profoundly mistaken in this if we cannot give conditions under which we would be willing to change our minds.
Well, I mean, this probably doesn't answer your question directly, but one of the risks of saying that, within certain agreed limits, unless speech is going to cause imminent lawless violence, it should be permitted.
Yeah.
Is that lawless violence could be defined too broadly to encompass inflicting psychological pain on people. So I'm very wary of extending Mill's harm principle in that way.
Yeah, so
to prohibit psychological harm as well as physical harm.
Kind of institutionalizing Mill's harm principle to microaggressions at a social level.
Yeah. So I'm wary that someone might say, just as people say I accept Mill's harm principle, but I include in my definition of harm psychological harm, which hurty words can cause, and therefore they shouldn't be permitted. I'm wary of someone doing something similar with the imminent lawless action standard, imminent lawless violence standard, and defining psychological violence as being included in that standard. But one of the things the Free Speech Union, one of our more recent victories, is that in the Online Safety Bill, which the UK government has just passed, it's now the Online Safety Act, which will empower Ofcom to regulate social media, and will, I think, have quite a chilling effect on free speech on social media, and is similar to various other regulation of social media bills that have been going through parliaments across the world, through legislatures. The government initially wanted to include a new harmful communications offence, create a new offence whereby it was a criminal offence punishable by up to 2 years in jail to say or write or communicate something which caused serious distress. And we were very concerned.
Virtually anything.
Well, I mean, virtually anything. And it doesn't allow for kind of, variable sensitivity amongst the people, the audience.
In American universities, it could be, where are you from, but not gas the Jews.
Right.
So I want to play a Douglas Murray clip in a second. Let's put our headphones on. I have a totally different take on that, by the way. But let's play the Douglas Murray clip.
Champions of freedom of speech. I've always been of the view that if people think something as horrific as this, I think it's better that we know it so we can tackle it, so we can challenge it, and we know what people really are, what is in their hearts, what is in their heads. But how do we tackle this? Because it seems to me that this is something relatively new on the left.
You know, for a few years ago, a maniac lone wolf gunman in New Zealand, a disgusting man, went into a mosque and massacred some Muslims praying. A lot of people, a lot of innocent people. And if in the aftermath of that there had been protests outside New Zealand embassies around the world supporting that gunman, the Met Police and others would have stepped in within a second. They would have been prosecuted in no time. And you know what? That would have been correct. Because it is actually a crime in the UK, as it is in other countries, to support and glorify terror. Glorification of terror is a crime under the 2006 Terrorism Act in the UK. You're not allowed to support Al-Qaeda and be free. You're not allowed to support ISIS and be free. You are not allowed to support Hamas, which is a proscribed terrorist organization in the UK, and be free. So as I say in The Spectator this week, I want the people who are supporting Hamas openly, including people who are leaders of Hamas, who we know are leaders of Hamas in the UK, to be arrested, to be prosecuted, to be imprisoned, to, I think, like ISIS, have their passports withdrawn, be made stateless. If they wish to live in the Gaza, they should do. They can take their chances there. Britain doesn't want or need them. Bye-bye.
Thoughts in general, and then thoughts on this idea of chanting Hamas is we love Hamas.
Yeah. Well, I think Julia Hartley-Brewer's argument is quite a good one, that if that is what people in our midst genuinely believe, if they're willing to express their support for genocidal terrorists who've committed recent unimaginable atrocities, then we want to know who they are. And won't employers want to know who they are so they can not employ them? I mean, I think just because I don't think it should be unlawful to say openly express your support for Hamas, I don't think that should be entirely free of any negative repercussions, any negative consequences at all. But I think I part company with Douglas, and the reason I do part company with Douglas on this issue is that imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had won the 2019 general election, had got an 80-seat majority like the Conservatives did. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, we know, has said some pretty unsavory things in support of terrorist groups in the past. I can easily imagine that under a Corbyn government now, if everything else had unfolded in the same way, in spite of that happening differently, and Israel was currently about to launch a ground invasion of Gaza, you can imagine a Corbyn-led government designating the IDF a terrorist group. And I'm wary of saying, let's just allow the government to designate various groups terrorist groups and make it a criminal offense to express any support for those groups, because under different circumstances, I can imagine Douglas and me under a Corbyn-led government, say that government is giving military and financial aid to Hamas in Gaza and has designated the IDF a terrorist organization. Douglas and me would nevertheless want to be out on the streets protesting and expressing our support for the IDF. And do we want to grant the government the power to arrest and imprison us for being able to express that point of view? And if we don't want the government to have that power, then it feels a bit arbitrary to say, well, it's perfectly fine that the government does have that power now and it should be enforcing it.
So two things. First, and yet we know that there are legitimate bona fide terrorist groups, like ISIS would be the quintessential example of that. I found it interesting your response to her response. Her response is, we want to know who they are.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is it more likely that they're from Vietnam or from Saudi Arabia? But you don't have to answer the question because you know the answer.
Right.
So if you know the answer to the question, then there needs to be an honest conversation about immigration. And Reed and I have been to Speaker's Corner many times. We've had conversations with cab drivers who actually, they're the ones who are incredibly honest with us.
Right.
Uber drivers, excuse me. But I don't see that conversation happening in this country.
No, I think it's been a difficult conversation to have because people who have reservations about the current levels of inward migration, and reservations in particular about inward migration of young men from Muslim majority countries, is that people who have concerns about that are very unwilling to, most people anyway, to articulate them publicly for fear of being branded a racist or an Islamophobe. That's been an incredibly effective tactic to shut down, public debate about that particular issue. And one of the things I think may happen as a consequence of these mass protests every Saturday, in favor of, under the most charitable interpretation, in favor of Palestine and the Palestinians.
Yeah, Reed and I have been there. Yeah.
Okay. One of the consequences of discovering that so many, mostly Muslims, seem to be willing to give Hamas a pass about what it did on October 7th. Not all of the people protesting, but certainly some of them. One of the consequences may be that we can now have that grown-up, less inhibited discussion, that people can express their reservations about high levels of inward migration from Muslim majority countries without worrying about being accused of being racist or Islamophobic, because we've clearly got a problem.
That's fascinating because I have exactly the opposite take.
Really?
Yeah.
What's your take? My
take is that discourages people from having honest conversations. And I don't know how blunt I can be with you, but it seems blatantly obvious that you will get what you deserve. You will get that the body politic, the vox populi, if you will, when it remains silent, it is ineluctably drawn to certain, let us say, inevitable ends. And I don't see, maybe you see people like Douglas or certain people, but he hasn't changed his view as a consequence of this. He wrote about that in Strange Death of Europe and other people. So I don't know. We look at this as an example of looking at the same evidence, which we agree upon the evidence to protest from the river to the sea. We might have some subtleties, but we both know what that means. I see a certain tragedy unfolding here. I don't think there's anything you can do about it. So I think you can either accept it or just surrender to it now, get it over with. Because it's not going to change. It's only going to get worse. Unless you want to deny that, which seems to me to be denying the reality of the situation. I don't think you deny that.
Well, I think that is quite pessimistic. And I think I'm a football fan.
Yeah.
And
what is your team?
Queen's Park Rangers.
I don't know who they are. I know one team and I forgot their name.
Okay. But I see
Manchester United.
Manchester United. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, Arsenal. Yeah,
I
know them too. 11 players on the team. 11 players on the team, right?
That's right.
See, I know what I'm talking about.
But as a football fan, I see, how people who are, in a particular tribe, can revert to this atavistic tribal behavior when they're all together and they're confronted by people of another tribe.
Right.
And they can be quite offensive, rowdy, it is certainly not humanity at its most attractive.
True.
And I think it may be a mistake to conclude from the protests we've seen in major cities across the United Kingdom over the past 4 weeks, every Saturday.
Yeah.
To conclude that the people protesting and the behavior they engage in when they're protesting is representative of British Muslims.
Okay, let's pause right there. I think from what Reed and I saw that the protests, and Reed, jump in here if you want, but they were remarkably calm. That's what I saw. I didn't see any violence. I didn't see any. I mean, that doesn't mean that I'm not saying that there wasn't any. I'm just saying that we've been to these, I don't know how many of these, and we were at Speaker's Corner. And admittedly, yes, there were a lot of police at Speaker's Corner when we went, but I found them to be, the joke is mostly peaceful protests, but in my limited experience, I found them to be remarkably peaceful.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of people have seen those marches and concluded that we have a significant minority in this country who don't share our values, that they are antithetical to our values, and that's why we have a problem. And it's a problem that has arisen because people who've had reservations about mass inward migration haven't spoken up. That seems to be what you were driving at, unless I misunderstood you.
So
my counter argument was that it might be. I think it's unreasonable to conclude that because this particular outspoken group of Muslims who feel very strongly about this issue seem to be expressing sentiments completely at odds with our values, particularly when they express support for Hamas. But actually, they may not be being representative of themselves, let alone British Muslims. It may be crowd behavior, tribal behavior, in the same way that people aren't their best selves when they're enthusiastically supporting their football team. We wouldn't want to judge everyone in Shepherd's Bush by how QPR fans behaved on their way to and from games, or by some of the things that are said in the stadium. For the most part, I think they're pretty well behaved. But it would be, so people jumping to the conclusion that this group of protesters, seemingly celebrating terrorist atrocities are representative of British Muslims, I think is a bit too much of a leap. And actually, lots of the survey evidence suggests that when it comes to the vast majority of British values, when you measure patriotism, support for the royal family, the rule of law, religious tolerance even, because without religious tolerance, they wouldn't have migrated here. There is actually quite a lot of support, and there doesn't seem to be kind of on a few key issues. Of course, the Israel-Palestine conflict, there's going to be a big gulf between the views of British Muslims and the views of non-British Muslims. British non-Muslims. But for the most part, there's a huge amount of overlap, and it's not clear that there is this kind of estranged, alienated religious and ethnic minority that hate everything Britain stands for and want to tear our society down. if that was the implication of, if that was what you were driving at.
No, but it was a wonderful counter for if I were driving at it. That would have been the perfect way to make it legible. So there are how many people on the island here in the UK?
69, 70 million.
How many people?
I think that includes the population of Northern Ireland as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, but it roughly. And so, roughly, how many people in London?
Gosh, I think about 8 million in London.
Yeah. So, to be clear about a few things, I'm just, everything I'm saying is as an external observer. I'm not a subject. I'm not a citizen. I'm just coming in and seeing what I'm seeing. And I'm, I do jujitsu with a lot of Muslims. I get along with them fantastic. They're great. My barber's a Muslim. I get along great with him. I eat well. The cab driver's never given us any grief. It's interesting when, as I'm an atheist, but I get along great with Christians. I am concerned that many people I know who I consider my friends who are Jewish here have expressed to me deep concerns. And I think it's reasonable for me to take their concerns seriously. And I think it's reasonable for them to be concerned. I'm past the point of concern, though, and I'm into the point of worry. And when you talk about people sharing our values, they have every right to protest, peaceful, an actually peaceful protest. When they start rioting, you obviously cross the limit. When they start assaulting people, you cross the limit. But it's, or just listening to someone, my buddy Brendan O'Neill's podcast with Frank Ferrundi, talking about making the distinction between, I mean, this is first of all, it's a complicated area and it's outside my area, but I'm speaking to you about this because it deals with free speech issues. One of the things that Reed and I have found when we go around is most people do not want to talk about immigration, and they specifically do not want to talk about Muslim immigration. And when we ask them why off camera, they say they're fearful. Now you can drill down and get more granular on that, but it seems to me that there's a problem from the get-go. If they're not willing to have a conversation about something because they fear, well, the question is, what do they fear? Do they fear attacks from the left for being racist? Because I do think that there are people, I can think of one of them, I'm thinking whether or not I should say his name, like Tony Robinson, who are actual racists. And maybe they cloak that under the banner of incommensurable values in Western discourse, or maybe they cloak that under another banner. I am concerned about parsing that out. I'm also concerned about, in my own country, the failure of our particularly academic institutions to do anything. Forget about Israel. My own personal view, and we can talk about this, is I think universities should be neutral in all political matters, totally neutral. But there's a difference between a political matter, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is, again, outside my area, and simple denunciations, don't attack Jews. I put out a series of tweets on this in the pandemic about, why aren't universities putting this stuff out? I knew why they're not putting out. You know why they're not putting. Everybody knows why. Anybody who's followed this even a little bit knows why they're not putting out denunciations, where it's the slightest thing that could be conceived as a microaggression about a Native American or a trans person, et cetera. There'd be 500 tweets, there'd be letters signed, et cetera. So there's there's a grotesque asymmetry there. But I'm mentioning this to you in the context of free speech. Is someone justified in their concern that as Muslim immigration increases, people's fear to be honest about their concerns about immigration will calcify? Is that a reasonable concern?
Yeah. You mean, could it lead to a kind of English ethno-nationalism? The success of ethno-nationalist English political parties, which are opposed to immigration, that one response to things like protests every Saturday could lead to the kind of calcification of opposition to migration.
That could be one response, yes. Another response could be people just are terrified to say anything, and like you said, then they vote a certain way.
Yeah.
Right? That's what happens when we quell speech.
Yeah.
People in a democracy, people discharge those.
Yeah.
I mean, or is that a reasonable, if someone said that to you, would that be a reasonable concern? What I just articulated? Like that as percentage of Muslim immigrants increase, they become more fearful of speaking honestly and saying they're against immigration.
Well,
and therefore they vote for right-wing extremist parties.
It's possible, but I don't think the reason people who have reservations about high levels of migration are inhibited about expressing them is because they're worried about being attacked by Muslim extremists. I really don't.
Are they worried about the left telling them they're racists?
They're more worried about that. But it's more that it's not. It's an opinion which has fallen outside the Overton window. It's an unrespectable opinion to hold. It's an opinion associated with low status whites. So for status signaling reasons, because they don't want to be considered unrespectable or uneducated, they don't want to be associated with people like Tommy Robinson. They won't articulate those reservations. And the way to address that, I think, is of course, if people are frightened about being attacked for speaking out by Muslim extremists, then that's a problem, and a problem we have to do something about.
Which would be what?
Well, I've just signed my name to a letter to the Charity Commission complaining about various anti-Semitic things that imams have said in various religious communities.
But the solution would not be to limit immigration from Muslim countries, in your mind?
Well, I think we need to limit migration across the board, but I'm not sure we should. And I think we need to take seriously a points-based immigration system, and we need to do more about the small boats, all of which is easier said than done. But I think all of those things need to be addressed. But I don't think we should. One of the reasons I voted for Brexit is that I didn't think that Europeans should find it easier to come here than non-Europeans. By the same token, I don't think we should restrict migration from Muslim majority countries, but not from European countries. I don't think that's the solution. I think it can be done in a more neutral, liberal way, but there is a way to address people's concerns. But just to go back to, you talked about your Jewish friends feeling vulnerable.
That's what they told
isolated.
Me. Yeah,
my Jewish friends have told me the same thing,
okay.
And I think it's partly because lots of institutions, particularly universities, seem to be arbitrarily enforcing their kind of anti-racism policies and not doing anything about people on campus, including academics, chanting from the river to the sea, the academic trade union, the UCU passing a motion calling for an intifada.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's an institutional bias, not just in universities, but in lots of other institutions, cultural institutions, but also the police seem to be much more concerned to, arrest gender critical feminists than they do people who are being obviously hatefully anti-Semitic on the streets and so forth. But I think the way to address that is to apply pressure to our institutions, particularly universities and the police, to just become more neutral, not to make them more censorious across the board, but to make them neutral between different points of view and genuine enforcers of the policies they claim to uphold without fear or favor, which they're certainly not at the moment. But also, I think, what about a counter protest? I would love to get involved in organizing a counter protest which dwarfs the size of the protests that we've seen across our cities over the past 4 weeks. I mean, I and some other people started something called the October Declaration to express solidarity with British Jews and to condemn anti-Semitism here and in the Middle East, and to express some support for Israel, but also to express some sympathy for innocent civilians being killed in Gaza. And we got 200 plus members of the Great and the Good to sign it. We put it online. We encourage people to sign it. And so far, about 73,000 plus people have signed it. So I think the support for British Jews is much greater than a lot of British Jews imagine, having just seen the police apparently tolerating this behavior on our streets in our cities.
Okay, so let me...
They don't realize just how much support, how much love there is for them out there.
So let me ask you a question. If you wanted to show Jews here that there was love and support for them, would a better way be to do something like the October Declaration, or would a better way to be to limit immigration from Muslim majority countries?
I think the October Declaration and counter protest is the way to go, not to have a kind of a racially or religiously skewed immigration policy.
Well, it wouldn't be racial because you'd also rule out Indonesia, for example, the largest Muslim. I'm just throwing these ideas out for because I've been thinking about these issues as well, and I don't know if, to be very blunt with you, I don't know if being a signatory on another letter is going to do anything. Like, I don't know, maybe that's just the wrong, it's a kind of virtue signaling, or maybe verbal behavior embedded in virtue signaling. It's a kind of saying, look, everything you said was such a low bar. It's amazing there has to be a letter for it. Like, if you really want some to show people who are Jewish here, if you look at maps, I saw a wonderful map. I wish I had bookmarked this on Twitter or X, whatever it's called, of Muslim immigration and directly correlated. Is it causal? Almost definitely, but let's bracket that for a second with the exodus of Jews, like diasporas from Malmo, Sweden. You go around. I find that deeply disconcerting, especially given the history. So I certainly don't have to tell you about. I'm not sure. One of the questions that Reed and I ask when we go to parks, etc., is, should immigration be limited? And then we'll parse it out by region of the world. Should immigration be limited from Africa? Should immigration be limited from Asia? Should immigration be? I even put in the United States and Canada. I tell people, don't worry, I won't be offended. Should immigration, and we'll see where they go, to which line they go. But even then, I'm not sure if they're being honest.
Well, I think one nuance to this discussion that you may be missing,
please,
is that I think high levels of inward migration from Muslim majority countries has been much more of a problem in some parts of the world than others.
For sure.
It's a much bigger problem in France, for instance,
for sure,
than it is in Britain.
Right.
And of course, it's shocking to see the kinds of things being chanted by protesters in our cities over the past 4 weeks. But until that point, I think we could say that multiculturalism had, broadly speaking, been a success in our country. I mean, I, for years, lived in Shepherd's Bush, now live in Acton, which is a very racially mixed area, and would, when I was taking my kids to school, walk past a mosque on the corner of my street every day. And, different racial groups with different religious beliefs. I was taking my kids to a Church of England school, would rub along completely happily together. There was no conflict in the street. There were no running battles.
Yeah.
People would joke about, the number of Somalis and call Shepherd's Bush Road Mogadishu Mile or whatever.
Yeah.
But there was very little racism, very little racial conflict.
Fantastic.
Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood, for the most part, hadn't come to pass. We have had, riots, and there has been, in some cases, a racial dimension to those riots, but they happen roughly once every 20 years.
Okay.
We don't. I mean, it sounds. Maybe it's easy for me to say, because Shepherd's Bush is probably a more affluent area than Dewberry or Bradford, where maybe they have where
or the Heath.
I don't know about the Heath, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that for the most part, we've managed to absorb lots of migrants over the past, 70 years or so, without causing, major social upheaval. And it looks like, we may have been complacent about the impact of high levels of migration from Muslim majority countries on our cities. And, my liberalism, my belief in the success of multiculturalism is being sorely tested.
Yeah.
But I'm not willing to conclude that it's been a failure, and I've been naive, and I need to wake up.
Yeah, I'm certainly not willing or even taking the conversation in a place where I think you have to. I'm just trying to figure out, and I'm not saying I believe any of this. I'm just asking questions. That's the big thing now. It's weird. It's like you can't wonder anymore online because, if you wonder about something or you can't, I'm trying to tease out by asking you questions. Like, for example, would you be more concerned or less concerned if the number of Muslim, of particularly young men from Muslim majority countries doubled in the next year over what you have, would you be more concerned? And if the answer to that is yes, I would be more concerned, like, would you be more concerned if you were Jewish? Would you be more concerned about potential social upheaval? Then you're tacitly admitting that there's something intrinsically problematic there in a way that having large numbers of people from Vietnam isn't problematic.
Well, I think one of the challenges of migration is integrating the people that arrive in your country into your culture, your society, inculcating British values, getting them to value our country and to share our sense of the sacred.
So would you be more concerned if the number of Muslim men doubled in the next year?
I think I would be, yes.
So then there must be something.
But I don't think the solution is a cap on immigration from Muslim majority countries in particular. I think the solution is a cap on immigration across the board, a bigger cap than the one we have at the moment.
Okay, so are you concerned with people from Vietnam immigrating here, that there are going to be social issues that Jews are going to flee?
No.
Okay, so why would we want to put a cap on the number of people who come from Vietnam? Why wouldn't you single out the group that's the issue?
Well,
like if Jews were fleeing from people from Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, there may be, some genuine asylum seekers from Muslim majority countries who are at risk of being persecuted, killed in those countries,
100%.
whether because they're gay or because they're apostates. And should we really close our doors to them? But I think beyond that, the way to make it work is to impose, an income test or a level of education test or a skills test rather than a racial or religious test.
Yeah, I mean, so I just want to back up and support one thing you said. Why couldn't you just, like, if someone were gay from a country in which they're persecuted, 11 countries have Sharia law now, is my understanding. Why don't we just, I shouldn't say we, but why don't you just, can't you
make an exception for them? You can only come here from a Muslim majority country if you're gay.
Well, there are millions of gay people who are being murdered.
Yeah.
So that seems eminently reasonable to me.
Right, but quite a hard test to, invigilate. How can you tell?
Okay, but just bracket the logistics for a second. I mean, there are ways to deal with the problem. Again, implicit in that is that homosexuals coming from, for example, Saudi Arabia are less likely to be Jew haters.
But interestingly,
I mean, I could be totally wrong about that.
That is true at present. So a reason for being granted asylum under our immigration laws is if you are a gay person in a country that currently has Sharia law and persecutes gay people. I mean, we currently have that policy in place.
Right.
I mean, Suella Braverman recently challenged it, partly on the grounds that it was hard to test and people were taking advantage of it, pretending to be gay when they're not, etc. But we do currently extend more latitude to gay migrants from Muslim majority countries than we do straight ones.
When you're not thinking about this stuff, what do you think about?
Why QPR are doing so badly.
I think about the football team.
Yeah. But I think most of my time is taken up with kind of much more campaign focused stuff. So thinking about.
Go back for a second. Why is that so important to you?
What?
Like when I talk to English people, they'll tell me about their football teams, and they'll get like, why is how they're doing? Like, why does that matter to you?
I suppose because once you've decided who your team are, often they're the team local to where you live, and they kind of represent the place you come from, the place you kind of think of as your community, your home. You want the team that represents that place to do well. Not everyone kind of picks the team associated with their neighborhood or their locality, but it's partly, it's a kind of feels to me like for the most part, fairly benign form of tribalism, and allowing that part of your nature to express itself. But part of that is once you've joined a particular football tribe, you really want your tribe to excel, particularly in competition with other local tribes.
That's very alien to me.
Is it? You've never been a big sports fan?
That'd probably be an understatement. But I do like, I don't know if I want to go down this rabbit hole, but I do like one sport or maybe two. But okay, so when you're not talking about that,
I'm mainly thinking about campaigning, about how to lobby the government, how to organize people behind a particular campaign. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
So our government is currently thinking about publishing a bill which will ban conversion therapy. And I think that's a terrible mistake.
do you really?
Yeah, not least because conversion therapy in this country is already illegal. So what would the bill ban? Well, the risk is it would ban, we haven't seen the bill yet, but in all likelihood, it would ban religious leaders asking their community to pray for someone who was gender confused or same-sex attracted, or to just share with someone who came to them who said they were same-sex attracted, sharing what their faith teaches about that particular issue. And I don't think that speech should be prohibited. I think that would be a grotesque interference in religious liberty. But beyond that, another concern is that a conversion therapy ban would make it a criminal offense for a clinician, a doctor, to do anything other than affirm the self-diagnosis of a gender-confused adolescent and immediately send them on a irreversible pathway, whether it be taking puberty blockers, which do have lasting effects. We know they're not just temporary, or worse, a double mastectomy and the rest of it. But even worse than that, it might, as in the state of Victoria, which banned conversion therapy in 2021, even though conversion therapy, as it's commonly understood, was already illegal in the state of Victoria, it might criminalize conversations between parents and their children about whether their children should transition, whether their children should take puberty blockers. That hasn't been tested yet in the state of Victoria. But if the child could show that the parents attempt to persuade them not to take puberty blockers had caused them psychological harm, and they could self-harm, there's evidence that it had, then I think the parent would be prosecuted under the law in Victoria. And my concern is that if the government publishes a bill, it's not going to put it in the King's Speech. The plan is to publish it and discuss it. And the government thinks it can do all sorts of clever things to protect gender-confused adolescents, to make it harder, in fact, to trans away the gay by saying to a gender-confused adolescent, no, you're not gay, you're just stuck in the wrong body. Have a sex change operation. You'll be straight. Everything will be fine. They think they can define that as a form of conversion therapy and protect adolescents from being kind of browbeaten or hurried along on a kind of transition pathway. I think that's naive. When the bill's published, the LGBTQ plus lobby in the House of Commons will immediately bring its influence to bear, and it'll end up like the conversion therapy ban in the state of Victoria. And even if the government say, well, if that happens, we can just pull it. But they can't pull it. Once the government's acknowledged that gay, lesbian, and trans children are at risk of harm unless we legislate, it's going to be really hard to then pull the bill. Politically impossible. And even if this government, lets the bill slide a bit, the next government will have an oven-ready version of the state of Victoria's conversion therapy ban to put in place. I'll say, hey, the Tories came up with this. It isn't even our bill. So I think it's a terrible mistake for the government to let the genie out of the bottle by publishing a bill of this nature. And I'm trying, spend a lot of time thinking about how to dissuade the government from doing that and how to get other people to join that campaign.
What's your I won't keep you too much longer. We're almost at time, but is there a common element that unites the things about which you're passionate?
I suppose a belief in liberty, faith in humanity, faith in the demos to get things right, faith in democracy, a kind of loathing of dogma, authoritarianism.
What do you mean by the use of the word faith in that sense? Like do you mean as a synonym for trust or confidence?
I think trust and a kind of, optimism about those things.
Is your optimism, what guides your optimism? Is it empiricism? Is it that it's worked in the past? Is it there's something that's rationally embedded in those principles that you feel is a universal telos to which humanity should aspire? What is the guiding mechanism behind your
Well, I think it's a kind of it's not, I hope, naive optimism. I think it's much more rooted in a skepticism about the ability of smart, ideologically motivated people to successfully control ordinary people, to avert what they think of as potential disasters by regimenting how people behave and curtailing their liberties. I think for the most part, limited government, a small state, trusting people to be the best judges of what's in their best interests, leads to less harm. It's not perfect, but it leads to less catastrophic outcomes than trusting a group of masters of the universe to organize the world in a way they think will kind of minimize harm.
Would you be willing to do you need to go?
No, I'm just gonna. It's my daughter calling me. I'll call her in a minute.
We can wrap up real quick. Would you be willing to barter some of your liberty for more IQ points?
Meaning what?
Would you be willing to lose some of your liberty if you became more intelligent?
I would have thought that the smarter I am, the more painful it would be to have to submit to other people's authority, unless I volunteered to do so. So that feels like a...
So would you be willing to lose some IQ to gain some liberty?
I'm not sure I could afford to lose any IQ.
What would you be willing to do? How many games are in a football season, a soccer season, whatever you call it, football? How many games are in a football season?
Well, it varies from league to league, but
your league, the league of the team.
In my league, I think it's 43.
Holy shit! 43 games in a season?
Yeah.
Wow. Would you be? What's the name of your team?
Or it might be more. Queens Park Rangers.
Queens Park Rangers.
I think there are.
Okay, so let's say.
So there are 24 teams in the league, and they each play each other twice, and then there are league matches and FA Cup matches as well.
Okay, so I'm just gonna give a percentage. Would you be willing? What Green Park Rangers?
Queens Park Rangers.
Queens Park Rangers. Would you be willing for the Queens Park Rangers to lose 98% of their games in perpetuity for the end of time to the rest of history to gain more liberty?
Well, that would be quite a selfish decision for everyone to gain more liberty, or just me?
Everyone.
Yes, I think I would value liberty over and above.
What about just if you gain more liberty?
Then I think it would be too selfish a decision to make. I wouldn't want to.
What do you
condemn my children to that? All of whom are now fanatical QPR fans.
Oh, okay. Well, what QPR?
I think the question we usually ask ourselves.
Yeah.
You said you quite like Man United. Is
well, I don't think I've ever seen 2 seconds of a game. I just know the name.
Well, we live equidistant in Shepherd's Bush or Acton between Queens Park Rangers and Brentford.
Yeah.
Brentford are quite a successful Premier League team, and QPR are currently unsuccessful Championship team. And my kids sometimes joke, why didn't we turn right and support Brentford? Why did we turn left? And then the question becomes, well, what brings you kind of more pleasure, more excitement, greater satisfaction? Is it supporting a team that routinely wins but occasionally loses?
Yeah.
Or is it supporting a team that has kind of good streaks and bad streaks? You know, it's much more of a roller coaster. It must be the same dilemma that people suffering from mild bipolar disorder are faced with. Should I take a drug which basically creates a kind of mood flatline that kills the highs as well as the lows? Or is it better to live with the highs and the lows because that's just more exciting? Maybe the kind of net pleasure is identical, but I think I've managed to persuade my kids that supporting QPR in the long run is more exciting, more worthwhile, kind of just more fun, even though there's more misery than supporting Brentford.
What would you have to get socially in order for you to never watch another football game the rest of your life? Like, what would you barter that for? Not socially in terms of like, you know, women flock to yours and anything like that. I mean, just socially in terms of like a political issue. What would you be willing to barter that for?
I think if we had something like the First Amendment in this country, I would be willing to make that trade. Yeah.
All right, Toby. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Where can people find you?
They can find the Free Speech Union at freespeechunion.org and the Daily Sceptic at dailyskeptic.org.
Cool. Anything else you want to? Oh, Reed, do we have any super chats? Well, real quick. What is it? I can't read it. It's too far away. All right. I can't read it there. Toby, would love to see a reboot of the Modern Review with you and Julie Burchill.
So that was a magazine I started in with Julie in 1991, and it lasted until 95.
Cool. Well, you got someone who wants to see it.
Well, that's very kind of them. What we may do is produce a kind of archive online of everything that was ever published in the Modern Review. So we have got vague plans to do that.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot, Toby. I appreciate it. Thanks
Thank
a lot. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch you later when we're going to do a lot of Spectrum Street epistemology for future guests. It's going to be fun.
Thank you for watching. Everything we do is under the umbrella of the National Progress Alliance, nationalprogressalliance.org. It's a nonprofit, independent 501c3. Your generous donations keep us going and keep fueling content like this. So please help us out. Make a donation. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.